A CEO encounters a 6-year-old boy, never expecting him to be his biological son. Hi, my beloved story family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Happy 2025 to all the story lovers out there. May this year bring you joy, love, and stories that inspire your soul. Today, I want to share something from my heart. Recently, I've been wondering if my stories still touch you the way they used to. Seeing fewer comments on my last video made me question if I'm doing enough to connect with you. Every story I share comes from a place of love and passion, and your feedback means everything to me. If my stories have brought you joy, please write yes in the comments. And if there's anything I can improve, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for being my family and for inspiring me to keep creating. Let's make this year unforgettable. Now, let's begin today's story. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Central Park as Xavier Julian checked his Patek Philippe watch, 3:45 p.m. His fingers traced the watch's smooth surface, a reminder of his first major corporate success 3 years ago. The timepiece had been a gift to himself after closing a $100 million deal that put Julian Enterprises on the map. Now, at 35, he'd transformed his father's struggling tech startup into a Fortune 500 company, though the cost of that transformation weighed heavily in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Another board meeting had run late, pushing back his entire schedule. The quarterly projections had shown promising growth, but the board's questions about the pending West Coast Technologies merger had stretched what should have been a 2-hour meeting into a 4-hour marathon of presentations and negotiations. Xavier had maintained his usual composed demeanor throughout, but beneath that carefully cultivated exterior, exhaustion pulled at his edges. 97 unread emails illuminated his phone screen, each one marked urgent by eager executives and anxious shareholders. The modern glass and steel towers of Manhattan loomed above him, their shadows stretching across the park like reaching fingers. His corner office waited in one of those towers, a testament to his success and, sometimes in his darker moments, his solitude. The park hadn't been part of his intended route, but construction on Fifth Avenue had forced his driver, James, to take a detour. Something about the golden afternoon light filtering through the yellowing leaves had compelled Xavier to step out of his Mercedes S-Class. "I'll walk the rest of the way," he'd told James, ignoring the older man's concerned glance at the gathering clouds that threatened rain. Perhaps it was nostalgia that made him linger. He'd spent countless afternoons here during his MBA years at Columbia, often with the memory rose unbidden. A Beni Ama sitting cross-legged on a checkered blanket, law books spread around her like fallen leaves. Her braids had caught the sunlight, and her laugh had carried across the grass when he'd tried to distract her with theories about corporate social responsibility. "Corporate law firms aren't the enemy," he'd argued, watching her highlight passages in her constitutional law textbook. "Think about the change you could effect from the inside." She'd looked up at him then, her dark eyes serious despite her smile. "Some battles need to be fought from the trenches, Xavier. Not everyone can afford Park Avenue lawyers." He pushed the memory away, adjusting his bespoke Tom Ford suit jacket. The fabric, a subtle herringbone pattern in charcoal grey, had been selected by his personal stylist to project authority and sophistication. Image was everything in his world now. A world of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions far removed from the idealistic discussions of his graduate school days. His Italian leather shoes, handcrafted in Milan, crunched against the gravel path as he navigated through the scattered chess tables. The familiar scene brought back more memories. Weekend tournaments in high school, the state championships he'd won, the way chess had taught him to think several moves ahead, a skill that had served him well in the corporate world. The usual mix of retired professors and precocious children occupied the tables, their concentration creating pockets of silence in the otherwise busy park. The air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter, mingled with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves and the distant perfume of late-blooming roses from the conservatory garden. His phone buzzed again. Sarah, his executive assistant, was probably wondering why he'd abandoned his carefully curated schedule. Xavier had hired her 6 months ago for her exceptional ability to manage his increasingly complex life, and she'd proven herself invaluable. The message preview showed urgent updates about the pending merger with West Coast Technologies. Legal team needs sign-off on revised terms. Time sensitive. Billions hung in the balance of that deal. The merger would solidify Julian Enterprises' position in the tech sector and potentially double their market share. The board was counting on him, the shareholders were watching closely, and analysts had already begun speculating about the impact on quarterly earnings. Yet something made Xavier pause mid-step, his finger hovering over the notification. A sound cut through the park's ambient noise, a child's laugh, clear and bright like summer rain, carrying notes that tugged at something deep in his subconscious. Xavier looked up, his attention drawn to one of the stone chess tables near the fountain. The vintage cast-iron piece had been there since his own childhood, its surface worn smooth by countless games and seasons. A young boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, sat perched on the edge of his seat, studying the board before him with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. The child wore a navy blue private school uniform bearing the crest of St. Matthew's Academy, one of the city's most prestigious prep schools. Xavier recognized the insignia. He'd made several donations to their scholarship fund over the years. The blazer was slightly too large for the boy's frame, the edges frayed but meticulously clean, suggesting careful maintenance of handed-down clothing. His opponent, an elderly man with a shock of white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, watched with barely concealed amusement as the boy contemplated his next move. The man's weathered face and comfortable tweed jacket marked him as likely one of the retired professors who regularly frequented the park's chess tables, sharing their wisdom with younger players. Something about the scene tugged at Xavier's consciousness, demanding attention like an overlooked detail in a contract. The way the child held himself, the slight furrow of his brow as he analyzed the board, it stirred memories Xavier couldn't quite place, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. He found himself walking closer, drawn by an inexplicable force that defied his usual calculated movements. The fountain's gentle splash provided a soothing counterpoint to the distant city noise, creating an almost musical accompaniment to the scene unfolding before him. The boy's small hand hovered over a knight, his expression shifting through various calculations. Xavier recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn countless times in boardroom negotiations, the same focused determination that had helped him turn his father's failing company into an industry leader. The autumn breeze ruffled the child's dark curls as he finally moved the piece with decisive precision, sitting back with quiet confidence. His movements displayed a natural grace, each gesture deliberate and purposeful. "Check," the boy announced, his voice carrying the same self-assured tone Xavier had used in his youth, the same quiet certainty he now employed to sway board members and charm potential investors. The elderly man chuckled, adjusting his glasses to study the board. Sunlight glinted off the lenses as he leaned forward, his expression a mixture of surprise and appreciation. "Well played, young master. Very well played indeed. You've trapped my king quite elegantly." It was then that the boy looked up, perhaps sensing Xavier's presence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as their eyes met. Xavier felt his breath catch in his throat, his customary poise deserting him in an instant of recognition that defied logic but demanded acknowledgement. Those eyes, he knew those eyes. They were his own, mirrored back at him from a face that could have been plucked from his childhood photos, the ones his mother still kept in leather-bound albums in the family's Upper East Side townhouse. The boy's skin tone was a few shades darker than Xavier's, a perfect blend of his own complexion and... His mind raced back to warm summer nights, to law books spread across library tables, to passionate discussions about justice and equality with a brilliant woman whose dreams had burned as bright as her smile. Benny's face floated in his memory, her features overlapping with the child's in an undeniable pattern of shared genetics. "Checkmate," the boy declared triumphantly, moving his bishop to seal his victory. The piece made a soft click against the stone board, the sound seeming to echo in Xavier's ears like a gavel falling in judgment of his past choices. His opponent laughed heartily, reaching across the board to shake the child's hand with genuine respect. "You're getting better every week, Braylon," the old man praised, beginning to reset the pieces with practiced care. "Your mother must have taught you well. That combination attack was particularly impressive." The name hit Xavier like a physical blow, forcing him to grab the back of a nearby bench for support. Braylon. The possibility he'd been trying to deny crystallized into certainty, its weight settling around, his shoulders like a heavy cloak. It wasn't possible. Yet as he stared at the child's face, he couldn't deny the evidence before him. The boy had Benny's nose, her high cheekbones, the same graceful way of holding himself that she'd had. But everything else, from the set of his jaw to the analytical gleam in his eyes, was pure Julian. Looking at him was like seeing a photograph of himself at that age, but with Benny's features softening his own more angular inheritance. "What's your name?" Xavier asked, his usually commanding voice reduced to barely a whisper. The words seemed to float in the space between them, carrying the weight of unasked questions and unknown years. The boy looked up again, curious but unafraid. His gaze held the same directness that Xavier remembered in Benny's eyes, the same unflinching honesty that had first drawn him to her. "Braylon," he replied with a smile that was heartbreakingly familiar. "I come here every Thursday after school. Mr. Peterson helps me practice for the Scholastic Chess Tournament. Are you a chess player too?" Xavier's mind spun with calculations, dates and memories clicking into place like pieces on a chessboard. 6 years ago, he'd been finishing his MBA, preparing to take over his father's struggling company after the heart attack that had nearly claimed the older man's life. Benny had been in her final year of law school, her dreams of public service law burning bright against the corporate path he'd chosen. They'd talked about a future together, planned it out over late-night coffee and early morning walks in this very park. But then came the offer from Chicago, a prestigious position with a public interest law firm. It had aligned perfectly with her dreams, but stood in direct opposition to the life he'd been building in New York. The last time he'd seen her. His heart clenched at the memory. She'd asked to meet him here, said she had something important to discuss. But he'd been distracted, focused on the upcoming board presentation that would determine his father's company's future. He'd promised to call her back, to make time for a proper conversation once the crisis had passed. But then days had turned into weeks, weeks into months. And eventually, he'd convinced himself it was better this way. She deserved someone who could match her dedication to serving others, not someone consumed by corporate ambitions and shareholder value. A woman in a navy blue cardigan approached the chess table, her sensible shoes quiet against the gravel path. Her ID badge identified her as staff from Little Angel's home, the gold cross on the logo catching the late afternoon light. "Time to go, Braylon," she called warmly. "You have your violin lesson in half an hour, and Mrs. Chen doesn't like to be kept waiting." Braylon began gathering his things, carefully placing the chess pieces in their designated spots with a precision that echoed Xavier's own methodical nature. "Same time next week, Mr. Peterson?" he asked hopefully, shouldering his backpack, a worn leather satchel that seemed too large for his small frame. The elderly man nodded, his eyes crinkling with grandfatherly affection. "I wouldn't miss it, young man. Perhaps next time you can show me that Queen's Gambit variation you've been studying." Xavier stood frozen as Braylon walked away with the caretaker, their figures growing smaller against the backdrop of Central Park's autumn splendor. The boy's blazer caught the wind, making him appear even smaller, more vulnerable. A strange ache settled in Xavier's chest, an emptiness he'd never known he carried until this moment. His phone buzzed again, but this time Xavier didn't even glance at it. Instead, he turned to Mr. Peterson, who was still sitting at the chess table, a knowing look in his aged eyes that suggested he'd observed more than just the game. "The boy," Xavier began, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain. "How long has he been coming here?" Mr. Peterson's weathered hands smoothed over the chessboard, his movements deliberate as he considered his response. "About 3 months now," he replied, studying Xavier's face carefully. "Ever since little Angel's home took him in. Remarkable child, has his mother's heart and his father's mind, whoever they may be." The last words carried a weight that suggested the old man had already drawn his own conclusions. Xavier's fingers gripped the edge of the stone table, his knuckles white with tension. Little Angel's home, an orphanage. What had happened to Abeni? Why hadn't she told him about their son? The questions multiplied like pieces on a chessboard, each move revealing new complexities, new possibilities, new responsibilities. "Sir," Mr. Peterson's voice cut through his thoughts, gentle but firm. "The pieces don't move themselves. In chess, as in life, you must decide your next move with care, but you must decide." The old man's wisdom, shaped by countless games and years, cut through Xavier's confusion like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. Xavier straightened, pulling his phone from his pocket. With steady fingers, he cancelled every meeting for the next week, ignoring the immediate flood of concerned responses from his executive team. Then he called Patricia Montgomery, the city's most formidable family law attorney. The park's shadows had grown longer, the autumn light painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. He had a son. Somewhere in this vast city, a 6-year-old boy carried his blood, his features, his legacy. A boy who'd lost his mother and ended up in an orphanage. A boy who played chess with the same focused determination Xavier had once shown, before spreadsheets and profit margins had consumed his world. As he walked back to his waiting car, Xavier Julian made a promise to himself and to the memory of Abeni Amma. He would make this right. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would find a way to be the father that Braylon deserved. The autumn wind whipped around him, carrying the distant sound of children's laughter and the weight of second chances. His driver opened the door, but instead of heading back to the office, Xavier had a new destination in mind. "Take me to Montgomery and Associates," he instructed, naming the law firm known for handling the city's most sensitive family cases. As the car pulled away from the curb, Xavier watched Central Park recede in the rearview mirror, knowing that his life had irrevocably changed in the space of a single autumn afternoon. The chess pieces had been set in motion. Now it was his move, and this time he wouldn't let success come at the cost of what truly mattered. The game that really counted wasn't played in boardrooms or on balance sheets. It was the one that had just begun. With stakes higher than any corporate merger could ever match, thunder rolled in the distance as the first drops of rain began to fall, nature itself seeming to mark the moment when Xavier Julian's carefully ordered world shifted on its axis, reorienting itself around the existence of a small boy with his eyes and Abeni's smile. Chapter 2. The search begins. The morning after his encounter in Central Park dawned grey and restless, matching Xavier's state of mind. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Upper East Side penthouse, watching the city slowly come to life below. Sleep had eluded him, his thoughts constantly returning to Braylon's face, to those eyes that mirrored his own, to the 1,000 questions that demanded answers. His phone had been ringing since dawn, Board members, executives, and his assistant, all trying to understand why their CEO had suddenly cleared his schedule for the week. The merger negotiations with West Coast Technologies hung in balance. Stock prices would likely fluctuate with the news of his absence. But for the first time in his career, Xavier Julian couldn't bring himself to care about market reactions. Patricia Montgomery's office had scheduled him for a 9 a.m. meeting. At 8:30, he stood in his walk-in closet, staring at rows of impeccably tailored suits, each one a piece of armor he'd worn in corporate battles. Today felt different. He selected a charcoal grey suit, less severe than his usual choices, paired with a deep blue tie that reminded him of Abeni's favorite color. The drive downtown was a blur of memories. Each street seemed to hold echoes of their time together. The coffee shop where they'd spent countless study sessions, the small Italian restaurant where they'd celebrated her law school acceptance, the bench near Columbia where they'd shared their dreams of changing the world, he in the corporate realm, she in public interest law. Montgomery and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a historic building in the financial district. The elevator doors opened to reveal an office that managed to be both welcoming and intimidating, much like Patricia Montgomery herself. The attorney's reputation preceded her. She was known for handling high-profile family cases with discretion and ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Julian," Patricia greeted him, rising from behind a massive mahogany desk. She was shorter than he'd expected, but her presence filled the room. "Your call last night intrigued me. It's not often I get emergency requests from CEOs of Fortune 500 companies." Xavier took the offered seat, noting the wall of law books behind her. Not for show, judging by their well-worn spines. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Ms. Montgomery." "Patricia, please." She sat back, her keen eyes studying him. "Tell me about the boy." For the next hour, Xavier recounted everything. The chance encounter in the park, the undeniable resemblance, his history with Abeni, and the growing certainty that Braylon was his son. Patricia listened without interruption, taking occasional notes in a leather-bound notebook. "Little Angel's home," she mused when he finished. "I know the place. Sister Margaret runs a tight ship. They're protective of their children, as they should be." She tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Julian?" The question caught him off guard. What did he want? 24 hours ago, his wants had been clear: close the merger, expand the company, continue building his empire. Now, "I want to know my son," he said finally, the words carrying more emotion than he'd intended. "I want to understand what happened to Abeni, why she never told me about him, how he ended up in an orphanage, and then—" He paused, the magnitude of what he was considering hitting him fully. "Then I want to be his father, in whatever way possible." Patricia nodded slowly. "This won't be simple. We'll need to establish paternity legally. There will be questions about why you weren't in his life before. The home will want to ensure you're not just acting on impulse. They've seen too many parents appear and disappear again." "I understand," Xavier replied, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes." "Very well." Patricia pulled out a fresh legal pad. "First, we need information. I'll start the legal proceedings to request access to Braylon's records, but that will take time. Meanwhile, I suggest you hire a private investigator to look into Abeni's last known whereabouts. When did you last have contact with her?" Xavier closed his eyes, remembering. 6 years ago, just before graduation. She was moving to Chicago for a position with a public interest law firm. We lost touch after that. Patricia's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she was forming her own opinions about the situation. "Do you remember the firm's name?" "Justice Advocates International," Xavier replied, the name coming back to him suddenly. "She was excited about their work with immigrant communities," the attorney made a note. "I know them. Good organization. I'll have my office make some discreet inquiries." She looked up at Xavier. "Mr. Julian, I need to be clear about something. If we confirm Braylon is your son, and if you pursue custody or visitation rights, your life will change dramatically. The media will eventually get wind of this. Your board, your shareholders, they'll all have questions. Are you prepared for that?" Xavier thought about the boy's chess moves, his confident smile, the way he carried himself with a dignity beyond his years. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Whatever the consequences." "Good." Patricia pressed a button on her desk phone. "Angela, please bring in the preliminary paperwork for a paternity case. And contact Harrison Investigations. I need James Harrison personally for this one." The next few hours passed in a blur of signatures and strategy sessions. Patricia's team began the legal process while her investigator, Harrison, took detailed notes about Urbani, her full name, previous addresses, mutual friends, anything Xavier could remember that might help trace her movements over the past 6 years. By late afternoon, Xavier sat in Harrison's office in a converted brownstone near Greenwich Village. The investigator's space was a stark contrast to Patricia's polished chambers, walls lined with filing cabinets, a desk cluttered with papers, and multiple computer monitors displaying various database searches. "Chicago has good records," Harrison muttered, his fingers flying over his keyboard. "If she was practicing law there, we'll find a trail." He was older than Xavier had expected, with grey temples and reading glasses perched on his nose, but his reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found was legendary. "Here's something," Harrison said after an hour of searching. "Urbani Amma passed the Illinois bar 6 years ago, worked for justice advocates until—" He paused, his expression softening. "Mr. Julian, I'm sorry. According to these records, she passed away 3 years ago. Car accident on Lakeshore Drive." The words hit Xavier like a physical blow. Urbani was gone. The brilliant, passionate woman who had challenged him to be better, who had carried their child without his knowledge. She was gone, and he'd never know why she'd kept Braylon's existence from him. "The boy," he managed to say through the tightness in his throat. "What happened to him after?" Harrison turned back to his screens, typing rapidly. "Give me some time on that. Juvenile records are sealed, but there are usually traces if you know where to look. Medical records, school enrollments." Xavier's phone buzzed. Sarah, his assistant, marking the 20th missed call of the day. The message preview showed mounting concerns from the board about his absence. He turned the phone face down on Harrison's desk. "Take all the time you need," he told the investigator. "I want everything you can find about both of them. Urbani's life in Chicago, Braylon's journey to Little Angel's home, all of it." Harrison nodded, understanding the weight of the task. "I'll have preliminary findings by tomorrow morning, but Mr. Julian ... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In my experience, when we dig into the past, we sometimes find things we wish we hadn't. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Xavier thought about the board meetings he'd cancelled, the merger hanging in limbo, the carefully constructed world he'd built that now seemed hollow in comparison to the weight of his discovery. "I've spent my career analyzing risks and calculating outcomes," he said quietly, "but this isn't about business strategy. This is about my son." The word felt both foreign and right on his tongue. His son. Somewhere in this city, Braylon was probably doing his homework, or practicing violin, or perhaps playing another game of chess, unaware that his father was frantically trying to bridge the years between them. As Xavier left Harrison's office, the city lights were beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. His driver waited patiently, but instead of heading home, Xavier directed him back to Central Park. The chess tables were empty now, the evening chill having driven away the last players. He sat at the table where he'd seen Braylon, running his fingers over the smooth stone surface. Tomorrow would bring answers, some welcome, others perhaps painful. But as he sat there in the gathering darkness, Xavier made another promise to himself and to Abeni's memory. Whatever the investigation revealed, whatever obstacles lay ahead, he would not rest until he found a way to be part of his son's life. He owed that much to Braylon, to Abeni, and to the man he'd once promised to become. The autumn wind rustled through the nearly bare trees, carrying with it the faint sound of distant traffic and the weight of years that couldn't be reclaimed. But perhaps, Xavier thought as he finally rose from the chess table, they could still forge something new from the pieces that remained. His phone buzzed again, Harrison this time. "Found something in the Chicago records," the message read. "Can you come by first thing tomorrow?" Xavier typed a quick, affirmative response, then called Patricia to update her on the developments. Tomorrow would bring more answers, more complications, more steps toward whatever future lay ahead. But for now, he sat back in his car, watching the park disappear behind him, carrying the image of his son's smile and the echo of a laugh that sounded so much like his own. The pieces were moving, the game advancing, and this time, Xavier Julian wouldn't let anything stand in the way of making things right. Chapter 3. Legal Battles. The Manhattan family court building loomed before Xavier, its austere facade a stark contrast to the corporate towers he usually frequented. 2 weeks had passed since his discovery in Central Park, and Harrison's investigation had yielded both answers and new questions. Now, on a crisp Monday morning, Xavier prepared to take the first official step toward claiming his role in Braylon's life. Patricia Montgomery stood beside him on the courthouse steps, her burgundy briefcase containing the carefully prepared petitions and supporting documentation. The morning sun glinted off her silver hair, casting a professional halo around her determined expression. "Remember," she cautioned as they climbed the steps, "family court is different from corporate law. Here, the best interests of the child supersede everything else, including your rights as a biological parent." Xavier nodded, adjusting his tie. He'd chosen a navy suit today, less imposing than his usual corporate armor. Harrison's investigation had revealed that Braylon had been in the Chicago foster system for nearly 2 years after Abeni's death, before being transferred to Little Angel's home in New York through an interstate placement program. The marble halls echoed with their footsteps as they made their way to courtroom 3B. Several other cases were scheduled before theirs: custody battles, adoption proceedings, the complex web of family law playing out in hushed tones and occasional tears. Sister Margaret from Little Angel's home arrived precisely at 9:45 a.m., accompanied by their attorney David Chen. Xavier had researched him, a former public defender who now specialized in children's advocacy. The nun's stern expression softened slightly when she saw Xavier, perhaps recognizing the anxiety he couldn't quite hide. "Mr. Julian," she acknowledged with a slight nod, "I trust you understand why we must proceed carefully in this matter." "I do, sister," Xavier replied, meaning it. The past 2 weeks had given him time to understand the home's perspective. They were protecting a child who'd already lost too much. Judge Eleanor Martinez called their case at 10:15. The courtroom was smaller than Xavier had expected, more intimate than the vast corporate litigation spaces he knew. The judge, a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the initial petitions with careful attention. "This is an unusual case," she noted, looking over her reading glasses at the assembled parties. "Mr. Julian, you're seeking to establish paternity and requesting visitation rights with a minor child you've only recently discovered exists. Sister Margaret, your institution has concerns about the timing and nature of this claim. Let's proceed step by step." Patricia rose first, her voice carrying the perfect blend of professional distance and human understanding. "Your Honor, We've submitted DNA test results confirming Mr. Julian's paternity with 99.99% certainty. The samples were collected and processed according to all legal requirements. She presented the court with a detailed timeline. Xavier's relationship with Abini during their graduate school years, their separation due to career paths, and the tragic circumstances that had led to their son being placed in the foster system. My client was unaware of his son's existence, Patricia explained. Ms. Armour's attempts to contact him were sent to outdated addresses during a period when Mr. Julian was establishing his company and had changed residences several times. We have documentation of these attempted communications, discovered through our investigation. David Chen rose next, his expression sympathetic but determined. Your Honor, while we don't dispute the biological connection, Little Angel's home has concerns about the impact of sudden changes on Braylon's emotional well-being. The child has already experienced significant trauma and displacement. He's only recently begun to settle into a stable routine with us. Sister Margaret was called to testify about Braylon's adjustment to the home. Her testimony painted a picture of a resilient but vulnerable child, brilliant at chess and violin, excelling in his studies, but still processing the loss of his mother and the transitions he'd endured. He asks about his father sometimes, Sister Margaret admitted, her voice softening, but he's also developed close bonds with our staff and the other children. Any disruption to his current stability must be handled with extreme care. Xavier listened, his heart aching at each new detail about his son's life. The violin lessons he'd never attended, the chess tournaments he'd missed, the nights Braylon had wondered about his father. Each revelation was both a gift and a wound. When it was his turn to testify, Xavier rose slowly, acutely aware that his usual boardroom confidence would not serve him here. This wasn't about market shares or profit margins. It was about proving he could be the father Braylon deserved. I understand that my sudden appearance raises concerns, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I can't change the past 6 years. I can't bring back the time I lost with my son or with his mother. But I can be here now. He described the moment in the park when he'd first seen Braylon, the immediate recognition, the overwhelming desire to be part of his son's life. I'm not asking to disrupt his current placement immediately, Xavier explained. I'm asking for the chance to know my son and for him to know me in whatever way the court deems appropriate. Judge Martinez leaned forward. Mr. Julian, your resources are considerable. You could provide Braylon with every material advantage, but children need more than financial security. How do you plan to balance your corporate responsibilities with the demands of building a relationship with a 6-year-old boy? It was the question Xavier had been wrestling with since that first day. I've already begun restructuring my role at Julian Enterprises, he answered. I've appointed a chief operating officer to handle daily operations, and I'm reducing my direct involvement in projects that require extensive travel. My priority now is creating space in my life for Braylon. The judge nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Sister Margaret. Would supervised visitation, initially at Little Angel's home, be feasible? Sister Margaret exchanged glances with David Chen before responding. We would need to prepare Braylon carefully, perhaps with the help of our child psychologist. But yes, supervised visits could be arranged, provided Mr. Julian commits to consistency. Consistency is crucial, Judge Martinez emphasized, turning back to Xavier. Children in Braylon's situation have experienced enough uncertainty. If you begin this process, you must be prepared to follow through, regardless of other demands on your time. I understand, Your Honor, Xavier replied firmly. I'm committed to whatever parameters the court sets. The hearing continued for another hour, with both legal teams presenting detailed proposals for a graduated visitation schedule. Patricia had prepared a comprehensive plan that would begin with supervised visits at the home, potentially progressing to outside activities as trust was established. Finally, Judge Martinez rendered her initial ruling. "I'm granting the petition to establish paternity," she announced. "Regarding visitation, we'll proceed cautiously. Mr. Julian will be permitted 2 supervised visits per week at Little Angel's home, each lasting 1 hour. After 6 weeks, we'll reconvene to evaluate progress and consider adjustments to the schedule." She fixed Xavier with a stern look. "Mr. Julian, these visits are court-ordered. Barring genuine emergencies, you are expected to attend each one. Consistency and reliability will be key factors in any future modifications to this arrangement." "Yes, Your Honor," Xavier responded, relief and anticipation mixing in his chest. It was a start, a carefully controlled, professionally monitored start, but more than he'd had yesterday. As the court adjourned, Sister Margaret approached Xavier. "Braylon has chess club on Thursdays," she said quietly. "Perhaps that would be an appropriate time for your first visit. He's comfortable there, and it's something you share." Xavier swallowed past the tightness in his throat. "Thank you, sister. I'd like that very much." Outside the courthouse, Patricia reviewed the next steps with him. Paperwork to file, evaluations to schedule, a meeting with the home psychologist to plan how best to introduce him to Braylon. But Xavier's mind was already on Thursday, on the chess table where he'd first seen his son, on the chance to begin building something new from the pieces of their broken past. His phone buzzed with messages from the office. The merger team needed decisions, the board wanted updates, the business world continued its relentless pace. But for the first time in his career, Xavier Julian let the corporate demands wait. He had more important moves to consider now. As his car pulled away from the courthouse, Xavier watched the autumn leaves swirl across the steps where his life had just changed again. Thursday seemed both too close and too far away. He would spend the intervening days preparing, not with corporate strategies or financial projections, but with memories of chess games played in this very park, hoping to bridge the years between father and son, one move at a time. The legal battle had been won, but the real challenge lay ahead, earning the trust of a brilliant, wounded little boy who shared his blood, but didn't yet know his heart. Xavier touched the chess piece in his pocket, a black knight he'd carried for luck since his own tournament days. Perhaps soon he could teach Braylon the strategies that had once brought him joy before spreadsheets replaced chessboards in his life. For now, though, he had preparations to make. A father's journey was beginning, one careful move at a time. Chapter 4. Painful Truths. The manila envelope sat unopened on Xavier's desk, Harrison's neat handwriting marking it Abeni Ama, complete findings. It had arrived early that morning, just before his first scheduled visit with Braylon at Little Angel's home. Now, as the autumn sunset painted his office in shades of amber and gold, Xavier finally found the courage to break the seal. James Harrison's investigation had been thorough, as promised. The envelope contained a detailed timeline of Abeni's life after their separation, meticulously reconstructed through public records, interviews, and archived communications. Xavier's hands trembled slightly as he began to read. The first document was a letter dated 6 years ago, written in Abeni's distinctive flowing script. It had been returned to sender, marked Address Unknown. The paper was crisp, preserved in a protective sleeve, but the words carried the weight of years lost. Dear Xavier, I've tried calling, but your number has changed. There's something important we need to discuss, something that will change both our lives. I'm pregnant, the baby is yours, and regardless of what happens between us, I believe you have the right to know. Xavier had to stop reading, his vision blurring. He remembered that period clearly now, the chaos of taking over his father's company, changing his contact information to avoid corporate raiders and persistent journalists. He'd been so focused on saving the family business that he'd made himself virtually unreachable to anyone outside his immediate business circle. The investigation continued, with bank records showing Abeni's withdrawal from law school, followed by her move to Chicago. She'd taken a position with a smaller firm than originally planned, one that offered more flexible hours for a single mother. There were medical records, prenatal care appointments, and finally, a birth certificate. Braylon Xavier Amma, born April 15th, 2019. Mother, Abeni Marie. Amma, father, not listed. She'd given their son his name, even without his acknowledgement. Harrison had interviewed Abeni's former colleagues in Chicago. Their testimonies painted a picture of a remarkable woman, balancing motherhood with her legal career, never speaking ill of her child's absent father, always maintaining her dignity and determination. She'd become known for taking pro bono cases involving family reunification, helping other parents and children find their way back to each other. The bitter irony of that detail wasn't lost on Xavier. Then came the accident report from 3 years ago. A rainy night on Lake Shore Drive. A truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel, a head-on collision that had ended Abeni's life instantly. Braylon, asleep in his car seat, had survived with only minor injuries. Xavier found himself standing, pacing his office as he had so many times during difficult negotiations. But this wasn't a deal he could restructure or a contract he could amend. This was the stark reality of opportunities lost and choices that couldn't be unmade. The investigation continued with Braylon's journey through the system. Abeni's parents had passed away years before, and she had no siblings. Despite her success as an attorney, she'd been young and focused on building her career. Their son's only family had been her close friends and colleagues. For 2 years, Braylon had moved through foster homes in Chicago, his bright mind and gentle nature noted in every placement. His chess skills had emerged during this period. One foster father, a high school teacher, had taught him the game as a way to channel his grief and intelligence. The transfer to Little Angel's home had come through the efforts of one of Abeni's former mentors, who'd maintained contact with Braylon's caseworker. The home's excellent educational programs and stable environment had made it an ideal placement for a gifted child who'd lost too much. But it was the next set of documents that truly broke Xavier's heart. Harrison had uncovered a series of emails Abeni had written but never sent, saved in drafts on an old account. They spanned the years, creating a one-sided dialogue with the father of her child. Braylon said his first word today, "Book." You would have smiled at that. He already loves to learn, just like both of his parents. He started chess lessons at school. His teacher says he has a natural talent for strategy. I see you in him when he concentrates on the board. Sometimes he asks about you. I show him the few pictures I have from our graduation. I tell him his father is a brilliant man who would love him if he knew him. I hope I'm right about that. The last draft was dated just 3 days before the accident. He's so much like you, Xavier. The way he analyzes everything, the way he tilts his head when he's solving a puzzle. I've been thinking about trying to find you again. He deserves to know his father, and you deserve to know this amazing little boy. Maybe now that my practice is established, I can take some time to... The message ended there, forever unfinished. Xavier sank back into his chair, the weight of missed opportunities crushing against his chest. All those years, when he'd been building his empire, his son had been learning to walk, to read, to play chess. While he'd been acquiring companies and making headlines, Abeni had been raising their child alone, never bitter, never vengeful, simply getting up each day and doing what needed to be done. A knock at his office door startled him. Sarah, his assistant, entered with concern etched on her face. "Mr. Julian, the board is waiting in the conference room. They're expecting an update on the West Coast merger." Xavier looked at his watch. 6 p.m. He'd been lost in the past for hours. The merger meeting had completely slipped his mind, but for once he didn't feel the usual surge of anxiety about keeping the board waiting. "Cancel it," he said quietly. "Cancel everything for the rest of the week." Sarah's eyes widened. "Sir, the merger ... The merger can wait." Xavier stood, gathering the documents with careful reverence. "I need to see Patricia Montgomery, and then I need to write some letters of my own." Back in his penthouse that evening, Xavier sat at his desk with premium stationery and a fountain pen, tools he usually reserved for signing major contracts. But tonight, he was writing something far more important: his first letter to his son. "Dear Braylon," he began, then paused, overwhelmed by everything he wanted to say. "How do you compress 6 years of absence into words? How do you explain to a child that his father had been blind to the most important thing in his life?" After several attempts, he started again. "Dear Braylon, your mother was the most remarkable person I've ever known. She was brilliant, kind, and braver than I ever was. I want to tell you about her, about the days before you were born, about how she lit up any room she entered. But first, I want to tell you how sorry I am that I wasn't there to see you grow, to teach you chess, to help you through the hardest days of your life." The words flowed then, page after page of memories, regrets, and hopes. He wrote about meeting Abeni in the Columbia Library, about their dreams and debates, about the person he'd been before ambition had narrowed his vision. He wrote about the day he saw Braylon in the park, about the instant recognition that had changed everything. He knew Braylon might not read these letters for years, if ever. But he kept writing as the night deepened, documenting everything he wished he'd been there to say in person. It was a poor substitute for the years lost, but it was a start, a way to honor Abeni's memory and perhaps someday help their son understand. Near dawn, Xavier sealed the last envelope and added it to the stack. Then he took out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to his board of directors, informing them of his decision to step back from day-to-day operations to focus on family matters. The second was to Patricia Montgomery, asking her to help him set up a foundation in Abeni's name, one dedicated to helping single parents pursuing legal careers. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Xavier looked again at the investigation files spread across his desk. Each document revealed a piece of the life he should have shared, the responsibility he should have shouldered, the love he should have given. The truth was painful, but it was also a gift, a chance to understand the remarkable woman who had raised their son and a roadmap to becoming the father Braylon deserved. In a few hours, he would have his second supervised visit at Little Angel's home. Yesterday's session had been brief. Just 30 minutes of watching Braylon play chess with Mr. Peterson, maintaining a respectful distance as Sister Margaret had advised. But today, perhaps they might exchange a few words over the chessboard, begin the long journey from strangers to family. Xavier carefully packed away Harrison's findings, knowing he would read them again and again in the years to come. Each detail about Abeni's life, each glimpse of Braylon's early years, was precious now, a thread connecting him to the family he'd almost missed having. The morning light streamed through his windows, catching the edge of Abeni's returned letter from 6 years ago. In it, she had written of changes that would transform both their lives. She couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how long it would take for their truth to finally emerge. Xavier straightened his tie, preparing to face another day of building bridges across the years he'd lost. The painful truths contained in Harrison's investigation had shown him what he'd missed. Now it was up to him to prove worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Not just to the courts or to Little Angel's home, but to the memory of a remarkable woman and the extraordinary son she'd raised alone. Chapter 5. Building Bridges. The recreation room at Little Angel's home buzzed with quiet energy as Xavier arrived for his fourth supervised visit. 3 weeks had passed since the initial court hearing, and each visit brought small steps forward in his journey to know his son. Today, early October sunshine streamed through tall windows, illuminating the chess table where Braylon already sat, setting up pieces with methodical care. Dr. Rachel Chen, the home's child psychologist, met Xavier at the door. Her presence had become a familiar comfort during these visits, her gentle guidance helping navigate the delicate process of building trust with Braylon. "He's been looking forward to today," she said quietly. "He mentioned yesterday that he's been practicing a new opening strategy he wants to show you." Xavier's heart swelled at this small sign of progress. Their first few meetings had been cautious affairs, Braylon polite but reserved, Xavier careful not to push too hard. They'd played chess in near silence, communicating mainly through moves on the board, but gradually, like sunshine melting frost, the ice had begun to thaw. "I brought something," Xavier said, showing Dr. Chen a carefully wrapped package. "His mother's chess set. Harrison found it in storage in Chicago. I thought—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Dr. Chen studied the package thoughtfully. "It's a meaningful connection to both his parents now. Let's see how he responds." Xavier approached the chess table, noting how Braylon's school uniform was pristinely pressed, his tie perfectly straight, small details that reminded him of Abeni's meticulous nature. "Good afternoon, Braylon." "Hello, Mr. Julian," the boy replied, looking up with those startlingly familiar eyes. They'd settled into this formal address for now, Doctor, Chen advising that Braylon should set the pace for any shift in titles. "I have something that belonged to your mother," Xavier said gently, placing the wrapped package on the table. "The investigator who helped me find you discovered it in Chicago. I thought you might like to have it." Braylon's hands stilled on the chess pieces, his expression a mix of curiosity and carefully contained emotion. With deliberate movements, he unwrapped the package, revealing a handsome wooden chess set with pieces carved from maple and ebony. "Mom's travel set," he whispered, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "She used to take it to the park on weekends. We'd play for hours, and she'd tell me stories about—" He stopped, glancing uncertainly at Xavier. "About her time in law school," Xavier finished softly. "About the chess club at Columbia." Braylon nodded, carefully opening the board. The pieces nestled in their velvet-lined compartments, each one holding memories of games played years ago. "She said she learned her best moves there. She beat me the first time we played," Xavier shared, remembering. "I was president of the chess club, undefeated that semester, and she completely dismantled my Queen's Gambit defense. That's when I knew I had to know her better." A ghost of a smile touched Braylon's lips. "She taught me the Queen's Gambit too, said it was a good lesson about sacrifice and long-term strategy." They set up the pieces together, each handling them with reverence. Xavier noticed a small mark on the white queen, a tiny chip he remembered from a day when Abeni had dropped the piece during one of their marathon study sessions. The imperfection had become a private joke between them, a reminder that even queens weren't perfect. "Would you like to play with these?" Xavier asked, watching his son's careful movements. "Or we can use the other set if you prefer." "These," Braylon decided firmly. "Mum would want them to be used." The game began, but today it was different. As they played, Braylon began to ask questions. Hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. He wanted to know about the chess club, about his mother's favorite strategies, about the tournaments they'd attended together. Xavier answered each question truthfully, sharing memories of Abeni that painted a picture of the vibrant young woman she'd been. He watched Braylon absorb each detail, noting how the boy's moves reflected both his mother's aggressive style and Xavier's own methodical approach. "She never said anything bad about you," Braylon said suddenly, moving his knight into a challenging position. "When I asked about my father, she always said you were brilliant and kind, but that sometimes life takes people in different directions." The words hit Xavier like a physical blow, testament to Abeni's grace even in absence. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman," he managed. "She saw the best in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it." "Do you deserve it?" Braylon asked directly, his gaze unflinching. "Sister Margaret says you're trying to make things right, but Mrs. Thompson thinks you might get busy again and forget about me." The brutal honesty of childhood cut straight to the heart of Xavier's deepest fear. He considered his response carefully, knowing this moment mattered more than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. "I can't change the past," he said finally. "I can't undo the years I missed, or make up for not being there when you and your mother needed me. But I can promise you this, nothing in my life is more important than being your father now, if you'll let me try." Braylon studied him with an intensity that reminded Xavier of Abeni during her most challenging cases. "Mom said promises are sacred things," he said seriously, "that you should never make one unless you're absolutely sure you can keep it." "She was right," Xavier agreed. "That's why I've made changes at my company. I'm no longer CEO. I've stepped back to an advisory role. My time is my own now, and I want to spend it getting to know you, being part of your life in whatever way you're comfortable with." The boy considered this while contemplating his next move. "I have a violin recital next week," he said finally, advancing his bishop. "At school. Mrs. Chen says you could come if you want. It would still be supervised, but—" "I'd be honored," Xavier replied, his heart leaping at this small invitation into his son's world. "I've never learned to play any instruments myself, but I've always loved classical music." "Mom played piano," Braylon shared, a shadow of sadness crossing his face. "She used to accompany me sometimes, before." He trailed off, focusing intently on the board. Xavier recognized the gesture. He had the same habit of using chess to process difficult emotions. "Would you tell me about your favorite pieces to play?" he asked gently, offering a safer topic. The conversation flowed more easily then, moving from music to school to Braylon's other interests. Xavier learned that his son excelled in mathematics, that he loved reading mystery novels, that he had a talent for languages inherited from Abeni, who had spoken 3. As their game progressed, Dr. Chen watched from her discreet position, across the room, making occasional notes. She told Xavier that these chess matches provided valuable insight into Braylon's emotional state, the way he played reflecting his feelings about each interaction. Today's game showed both caution and curiosity, defensive moves interspersed with bold advances. When Braylon finally checkmated Xavier's king, using a combination that clearly came from Abeni's playbook, both of them smiled. "Well played," Xavier acknowledged, studying the final position. "Your mother would be proud of that combination." "She used to say chess is like life," Braylon replied, carefully returning the pieces to their compartments. "You have to think ahead, but you also have to be ready when things don't go according to plan." The wisdom in those words, carried through years and lost to this moment, struck Xavier deeply. How many times had Abeni adapted her plans, faced challenges alone, kept moving forward for their son's sake? "Your mother was very wise," he said softly. "I should have listened to her more when I had the chance." Braylon closed the chess set with careful hands. "Maybe you can listen now," he suggested, his voice small but steady, "to the things she taught me." It was the most direct acknowledgement yet of a possible future relationship between them. Xavier felt the weight of it, the responsibility and the hope contained in those simple words. "I'd like that very much," he replied. Their time was almost up, but before they parted, Braylon hesitated, then pushed the chess set toward Xavier. "Could you Could you keep this safe for next time? I don't want anything to happen to it." The trust implicit in this request brought a lump to Xavier's throat. "Of course. I'll bring it to every visit, and when you're ready, it can stay with you." Dr. Chen approached, signaling the end of their session, but as Xavier stood to leave, Braylon spoke again. "Mr. Julian, Mom also said that the hardest games are sometimes the most important ones to play." Xavier recognized Abeni's gift for gentle wisdom in their son's words. "She was right about that too," he agreed. "Thank you for playing with me today, Braylon." Walking out of Little Angel's home, Xavier carried Abeni's chess set with the reverence it deserved. Each visit built another small bridge across the years of absence, each shared memory of Abeni helping to forge a connection between father and son. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from the office, but they could wait. Today, he'd seen his son smile, heard him speak of his mother, and been trusted with a precious piece of their shared history. In the chess game of life, these were the moves that truly mattered. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings as Xavier headed home to prepare for Braylon's upcoming violin recital. One step at a time, one visit at a time, they were building something new from the foundations of the past. And somewhere, he hoped, Abeni was watching with that gentle smile he remembered as their son taught his father the most important lessons about love, trust, and the sacred nature of promises kept. Chapter 6. Resistance. The conference room at Little Angel's home felt smaller than usual as Xavier faced the assembled staff review committee. 6 weeks had passed since his first supervised visit, and while his connection with Braylon had grown stronger, the path forward remained complicated. Sister Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by Mrs. Thompson, the home's veteran social worker, and Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring their visits. "Mr. Julian," Sister Margaret began, her tone gentle but firm, "we've called this meeting to discuss some concerns about the accelerated visitation schedule you've proposed." Xavier straightened in his chair, feeling oddly vulnerable despite his expertly tailored suit. He'd spent the previous night preparing for this meeting as meticulously as any board presentation. But here, his corporate expertise held little sway. Mrs. Thompson, who had been with Little Angel's home for over 20 years, spoke next. "We've reviewed your petition for expanded visitation rights, including overnight stays and off-site activities. While we acknowledge the positive reports from your supervised visits, we have serious reservations." She opened a thick file folder, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "You've been present in Braylon's life for less than 2 months. Before that, there was a complete absence of contact or support for 6 years. "I wasn't aware," Xavier began, but Mrs. Thompson held up a hand. "I understand you didn't know about your son," she acknowledged. "But please, try to see this from our perspective. Where were you when Abeni was working 2 jobs to put him through private school? Where were you during the midnight fevers, the first steps, the nightmares after her death?" Each question landed like a body blow, forcing Xavier to confront the full weight of his absence. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. "If I may," she interjected, "I'd like to share some observations from Braylon's sessions." She consulted her notes. "Braylon is showing signs of emotional conflict. While he's clearly drawn to Mr. Julian and curious about their connection, he's also experiencing anxiety about potential changes to his routine." Sister Margaret nodded. "Stability is crucial for children who have experienced significant loss. Braylon has only recently begun to truly settle here. His grades are excellent, he's forming friendships, and his music teacher reports remarkable progress with the violin." "I don't want to disrupt his progress," Xavier assured them. "That's why I'm proposing a gradual transition. The overnight visits wouldn't begin for another 3 months. And only after thorough preparation with Dr. Chen." Mrs. Thompson's expression remained skeptical. Mr. Julian, last week you missed Thursday's chess club meeting due to a business emergency. Braylon waited for 45 minutes before we received your call. Xavier felt his face flush with shame. The merger negotiations had reached a critical point, and he'd lost track of time during an emergency board meeting. "It won't happen again," he promised. "I've restructured my role at the company specifically to prevent such conflicts." "One missed visit might seem minor to you," Mrs. Thompson continued, "but to a child who has already lost so much, it reinforces fears of abandonment." Braylon spent that evening practicing violin until his fingers were sore. It's how he copes with disappointment. The image of his son playing through his pain struck Xavier to his core. "I've stepped down as CEO," he said quietly. "The paperwork was finalized yesterday. I'm maintaining my position on the board, but my operational responsibilities have been transferred to others." This announcement caused a stir among the committee members. Sister Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant change, Mr. Julian. Are you certain you won't regret such a dramatic shift in your career?" "The only thing I regret is not being there for the first 6 years of my son's life," Xavier replied, his voice firm. "I can't change the past, but I can ensure I'm fully present for his future." Dr. Chen made a note in her file. "Braylon mentioned that you gave him his mother's chess set. How did that interaction unfold?" Xavier described the visit in detail. Braylon's recognition of the set, the stories they'd shared about Abani, the boy's decision to entrust the set to Xavier's care between visits. As he spoke, he noticed Mrs. Thompson's expression softening slightly. "You've done your research about attachment theory and childhood trauma?" she asked. "Yes. I've been working with a family therapist to understand how best to support Braylon's emotional needs. I've also enrolled in a parenting course specifically designed for fathers entering their children's lives later than typical." Sister Margaret exchanged glances with her colleagues. "These are positive steps, Mr. Julian. But our primary concern remains Braylon's emotional well-being. We've seen too many cases where initial enthusiasm wanes once the reality of day-to-day parenting sets in." "I understand your skepticism," Xavier acknowledged. "My track record as a father is non-existent, but I'm asking for the chance to earn your trust, just as I'm working to earn Braylon's." Dr. Chen consulted her notes again. "Braylon's response to your visits has been cautiously positive. He's expressing more curiosity about you and his paternal family history. However, he's also shown signs of anxiety about potential changes to his current situation." "The other children are also a consideration," Mrs. Thompson added. "Many of them have their own complex feelings about absent parents. Your presence here, your obvious resources, it stirs up difficult emotions for some of them." Xavier hadn't considered this broader impact. "Is there something I can do to help? The foundation I'm establishing in Abini's name could perhaps provide additional resources for all the children's enrichment programs." Sister Margaret's expression sharpened. "Mr. Julian, while we appreciate the offer, we need to be clear. Braylon's placement and visitation rights cannot be influenced by financial contributions." "That wasn't my intent," Xavier assured her quickly. "I apologize if it seemed that way. I'm used to solving problems through business solutions, but I understand this is different. This is about earning trust through consistent actions and genuine commitment." The committee members conferred quietly while Xavier waited, his heart pounding. Finally, Sister Margaret spoke. "We're willing to modify the visitation schedule, but more gradually than you've proposed. Instead of jumping to overnight visits, we'll first extend the duration of your supervised visits to 2 hours. If those go, well, for the next month, we can discuss adding an additional weekly visit." "Additionally," Mrs. Thompson interjected, we'd like you to continue working with Dr. Chen and attend our parent education workshops. Braylon's trust needs to be earned step by step, and so does ours." "Of course," Xavier agreed immediately. "Whatever you think is best for Braylon." Dr. Chen smiled encouragingly. "I've observed genuine effort on your part to understand and adapt to Braylon's needs. Remember that you're not just building a relationship with your son, you're helping him heal from significant trauma. That takes time and patience." As the meeting concluded, Sister Margaret held Xavier back for a moment. "Mr. Julian, about last Thursday's missed visit." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Braylon told his music teacher that he understood busy people sometimes have emergencies. He said his mother had taught him that understanding doesn't mean the disappointment hurts any less." The words cut deep, a reminder of how Abeni's wisdom continued to guide their son. "I won't let him down again," Xavier promised. "See that you don't," Sister Margaret replied simply. "That boy has his mother's capacity for forgiveness, but he also has her memory for promises kept and broken." Walking through the home's corridors toward the exit, Xavier passed the music room where Braylon was having his violin lesson. The sound of Bach's concerto in a minor floated through the door, his son practicing the piece for his upcoming recital. Xavier paused, listening to the determined precision in each note. His phone buzzed with messages about the merger's final stages, but for once, the business world seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was here, in the music room where his son played his mother's favorite composer, in the recreation room where they shared chess games and memories, in the gradual building of trust with the people who had been there when he hadn't. The resistance he faced was fair, earned by years of absence. The path forward wouldn't be easy or quick, but Xavier was beginning to understand that this was exactly as it should be. Real relationships, like real trust, had to be built carefully, one genuine interaction at a time. As he left Little Angel's home, Xavier made a mental note to clear his entire schedule for Thursday's chess club. Some commitments couldn't be delegated or rescheduled. His son was teaching him that, just as Abeni had tried to teach him years ago about what truly mattered in life. The autumn wind carried the sound of Braylon's violin practice into the street, a reminder that the most important symphonies in life were composed of small, consistent moments of showing up, being present, and proving worthy of the trust placed in you. Chapter 7. Crisis. The call came during a rare, quiet moment in Xavier's new routine. He had been reviewing Braylon's latest chess tournament photos, proudly displayed on his desk, when his phone lit up with Sister Margaret's number. Her voice, usually so composed, carried an edge of urgency that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Julian, Braylon's been taken to Mount Sinai Children's Hospital. He collapsed during violin practice. The doctors suspect—" She continued speaking, but Xavier was already grabbing his coat, his driver's number dialed on his other phone. The drive to the hospital was a blur of autumn rain and racing thoughts. Sister Margaret had mentioned symptoms that had appeared gradually over the past week: unusual fatigue, pale complexion, unexplained bruising, signs that everyone had attributed to the intense preparation for his upcoming violin recital, until he had suddenly collapsed mid-practice. The pediatric intensive care unit was a world away from the corporate environments Xavier usually navigated. Gone were the polished marble floors and subtle power dynamics of his business world, replaced by the stark reality of beeping monitors and worried faces. Dr. Sarah Patel, the pediatric hematologist assigned to Braylon's case, met Xavier and Sister Margaret in a small consultation room. Her white coat bore colorful pins, an attempt to seem less intimidating to her young patients, but her expression was serious. "We've completed the initial blood work," she began, spreading several charts on the table. Braylon is presenting with severe aplastic anemia. His bone marrow isn't producing enough new blood cells. This explains the fatigue, the bruising, and ultimately, today's collapse. Xavier leaned forward, his corporate training kicking in as he sought to understand the complexity of the situation. What's the treatment protocol? Typically, we start with immunosuppressive therapy, Dr. Patel explained. However, given the severity of Braylon's case and his age, we believe a bone marrow transplant would offer the best chance for a complete recovery. Sister Margaret, who had been quietly praying her rosary, looked up sharply. "How urgent is this?" "Very," Dr. Patel replied frankly. "His blood counts are critically low. We've started transfusions to stabilize him, but we need to find a matching donor quickly." "Test me," Xavier said immediately. "I'm his biological father." Dr. Patel nodded. "We'll test you right away, but finding a match isn't just about biological relationship. The HLA markers need to align precisely. We'll also need to check the national registry and—" "Test me first," Xavier interrupted, already rolling up his sleeve. "Please." The next hours were a maze of medical procedures and paperwork. Xavier's blood was drawn, forms were signed, and Sister Margaret coordinated with Little Angel's home to gather Braylon's complete medical history. Through it all, Xavier's thoughts kept returning to Abini. How had she handled Braylon's childhood illnesses alone? Had she sat in hospital rooms like this, without anyone to share the weight of worry? Finally, they were allowed to see Braylon. The sight of his son in a hospital bed, surrounded by monitoring equipment, hit Xavier with physical force. The boy looked smaller somehow, his skin pale against the white sheets, but his chess set, Abeni's chess set, was open on the bedside table. "Hello, Mr. Julian," Braylon said weakly, attempting a smile. "I'm sorry I might miss our Thursday chess game." Xavier had to swallow hard before he could respond. "Don't worry about that. We'll play as soon as you're feeling better." He moved closer to the bed, noting how the IV lines snaked around the chess pieces. "Have you been playing?" "With Dr. Roberts," Braylon nodded toward the young resident, checking his vitals. "He's not as good as you or Mom, though." Dr. Roberts grinned. "He's being kind. He's beaten me 3 times already." Xavier settled into the chair beside the bed, watching as Braylon's eyes grew heavy with fatigue. Sister Margaret had stepped out to call the home, and the only sounds were the steady beeping of monitors and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. "Dad?" Braylon's voice was barely a whisper, but the word echoed like thunder in Xavier's ears. It was the first time his son had called him anything but Mr. Julian. "Can you tell me about when you and Mom won the chess tournament? The one at Columbia?" Fighting back tears, Xavier began the story, watching as Braylon drifted into an uneasy sleep. He kept talking even after his son's eyes closed, filling the sterile hospital air with memories of Abeni's brilliant strategies and victory celebrations. The next morning brought both hope and complication. Dr. Patel arrived with the preliminary blood work results. "Mr. Julian, you're a potential match, but we need to run more comprehensive testing to be certain. There are also some concerns about your recent international travel and business in areas with malaria risk." Xavier immediately pulled out his phone, cancelling his upcoming business trips. "Whatever you need me to do, whatever tests are required, I'm here. Nothing else matters." The following days blurred together in a rhythm of medical procedures and bedside vigils. Xavier learned the names of every nurse on the pediatric floor, memorized Braylon's medication schedule, and became an expert at setting up the chessboard around medical equipment. Little Angel's home's staff rotated shifts, ensuring Braylon was never alone when Xavier had to step out for testing or brief business calls he couldn't avoid. Mrs. Thompson, who had been so skeptical of Xavier's commitment, now brought Braylon's favorite books from the home's library. She found Xavier one evening, slumped in the bedside chair after a particularly difficult day of treatments. "You know," she said quietly, arranging fresh flowers on the windowsill, "Abeni would be proud of how you're handling this. It's not easy watching your child suffer." Xavier looked up, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "I keep thinking about her, about all the times she must have faced challenges alone. I don't know how she did it." "One day at a time," Mrs. Thompson replied, "just like you're doing now." A week into their hospital stay, Dr. Patel called another meeting. The news was both promising and terrifying. Xavier was indeed a match, but Braylon's condition had deteriorated faster than expected. The transplant needed to happen soon. "There are risks, Doctor," Patel explained, looking between Xavier and Sister Margaret. "For both donor and recipient. Mr. Julian, as Braylon's father, you have medical authority now, but given your corporate responsibilities—" "Do it," Xavier said firmly. "Whatever risks, whatever recovery time is needed, I'm ready." Sister Margaret touched his arm gently. "The board of directors can handle things without me," Xavier finished. "I meant what I said before. Nothing is more important than being here for my son." The night before the scheduled procedure, Xavier sat beside Braylon's bed, their chess game, interrupted by another round of medications. His son's hands shook slightly as he moved his knight, but his strategy was still sharp as ever. "Are you scared?" Braylon asked suddenly, looking up from the board. Xavier considered lying, then remembered Abeni's commitment to honesty with their son. "Yes," he admitted, "but being scared is okay when something matters this much." Braylon nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the chessboard. "Mom used to say that too. When I had to start a new school, or when we moved to a different apartment, she said being brave isn't about not being scared, it's about doing what's right anyway." "Your mother was very wise," Xavier said softly. "I'm learning that more every day. She also said—" Braylon paused, his voice trembling slightly, "that sometimes love means giving part of yourself to someone else. Is that what you're doing with the bone marrow?" Xavier reached for his son's hand, careful of the IV lines. "Yes, exactly that. And you know what? It's the easiest decision I've ever made." That night, Xavier slept in the hospital chair, waking periodically to check on Braylon. Each time, he found his son peaceful, the chess set still open beside him, the pieces arranged in their last game's final position. Morning brought a flurry of medical activity. As they prepared to take Braylon to pre-op, he grabbed Xavier's hand. "Wait!" he said urgently. "The knight, can you move it to e4? "I just figured out how to win in 3 moves." Xavier made the move, his throat tight with emotion, and watched as they wheeled his son away. Sister Margaret appeared beside him, her rosary beads clicking softly. "We'll pray," she said simply, "and then we'll wait. It's all in God's hands now." Hours later, as Xavier lay in his own recovery room after the bone marrow extraction, his first question was about Braylon. The procedure had been successful, they told him, but the critical period was just beginning. Through the fog of post-operative pain, Xavier remembered something Abeni had once said during a particularly challenging chess match. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice your strongest piece to win the game." He hadn't understood then, too focused on conventional strategies and predictable outcomes. Now, lying in a hospital bed while his son received the physical piece of himself he donated, Xavier finally grasped what she had meant. Some moves weren't about winning or losing. They were about giving whatever was needed, without calculation or reserve. The recovery room lights dimmed as evening approached, but Xavier stayed awake, watching the clock and praying to whatever power had brought him back into his son's life, in time to make this move, this sacrifice, this chance to finally be the father Braylon deserved. Chapter 8. The Gift of Life. The pediatric recovery ward was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, save for the gentle hum of medical equipment and the soft footsteps of night shift nurses. 5 days had passed since the bone marrow transplant, and Xavier sat in his now familiar position beside Braylon's bed, his own discharge papers lying forgotten on the side table. Dr. Patel had been cautiously optimistic about Braylon's initial response to the transplant. "His numbers are moving in the right direction," she'd said during evening rounds, "but the next few weeks are critical for engraftment." Xavier watched his son's peaceful sleep, marveling at how the boy's color had already begun to improve. The dark circles under his eyes were fading, and there was a hint of pink returning to his cheeks. On the bedside table, a Benny's chess set remained open, the pieces arranged in their last game's position, a game they hadn't yet finished. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Sister Margaret entered, carrying a worn manila envelope. "This arrived at the home yesterday," she said quietly, settling into the chair opposite Xavier. "It's been forwarded through several addresses. It was sent by a Beanie's former law partner in Chicago." Xavier accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The return address showed a law firm he didn't recognize, but the handwriting on the sealed inner envelope was heartbreakingly familiar. His name was written in a Benny's flowing script, followed by the words, "To be delivered in case of emergency regarding Braylon." "She thought of everything," Sister Margaret murmured, watching as Xavier struggled to maintain his composure. "Even this." With careful movements, Xavier opened the inner envelope, unfolding several pages of Abini's distinctive stationery. The letter was dated 3 years ago, just weeks before the accident that took her life. "Dear Xavier, if you're reading this, it means something has happened, and you finally found your way to our son. I've written versions of this letter many times over the years, trying to find the right words to explain choices made in youth and fear and pride. First, you should know that I never meant to keep Braylon from you permanently. When I discovered I was pregnant, I tried to reach you, calls, letters, even visits to your office. But you were in the midst of saving your father's company, and every attempt met with returned mail or changed numbers. I told myself I would try again once things settled, once I had established myself in Chicago, once I could approach you as an equal rather than a burden. Pride, perhaps, or fear of disrupting the path you'd chosen. The years slipped by, and Braylon grew into such an amazing little boy, so much like you in ways that sometimes take my breath away. He has your mind for strategy, your determination. When he plays chess, I see your expressions in his face, the same focused concentration you showed in law school tournaments. He's brilliant, kind, and stronger than any 6-year-old should need to be. I've told him what I know to be true about his father, that you are brilliant and kind, that circumstances and timing separated us, that sometimes life takes good people in different directions. I've never allowed him to believe he was unwanted or abandoned. The choice to maintain distance was mine, and I carry that responsibility. If you're reading this now, it means something has happened to me, and Braylon needs his father. I know you, Xavier, or at least I knew you once. You have a good heart beneath all those corporate strategies and market analyses. Our son needs that heart now, not your resources or your influence, but your presence and your love. The doctors have mentioned concerns about Braylon's blood work during his recent checkups. If these developments become serious, you should know that I've kept detailed medical records in a blue folder in my office safe. The combination is his birthday. There's so much more I want to say, explanations and apologies I've drafted 100 times, but what matters now is Braylon. Love him, Xavier. Be the father I know you can be. Let him teach you what I learned too late, that sometimes the most important victories have nothing to do with business deals or legal cases. I've enclosed a key to a storage unit in Chicago where I've kept photographs, letters, and mementos of Braylon's early years. He should have these pieces of his history, and you should know the beautiful boy he's always been. Forgive me for the years of silence, as I forgave you for being unreachable when I needed you most. We were both young, both driven by dreams that seemed paramount at the time. But Braylon is the best dream either of us ever had, and he needs you now. With hope and faith in the man I once loved, a Benny. Xavier lowered the letter, aware of tears falling freely down his face. Sister Margaret sat in respectful silence, her rosary beads moving quietly through her fingers. She didn't just protect him, Xavier said finally, his voice rough with emotion. She protected me too, my reputation, my relationship with him, even after everything. Abeni had a rare capacity for grace, Sister Margaret agreed softly. It lives on in your son. As if on cue, Braylon stirred, his eyes opening slowly. Dad? He murmured, still groggy from medication. Are you crying? Xavier quickly wiped his eyes, moving closer to the bed. I just read a letter from your mother. She wrote it for me to find if you ever needed me. Braylon's hand crept toward the chess set. Was it a good letter? The best kind, Xavier answered, helping him adjust his pillows. She wrote about how much she loved you, how proud she was of you. She told me about your first chess games, your early violin lessons. Can I see it? Braylon asked, his voice stronger. Xavier glanced at Sister Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they read selected parts of the letter, watching as Braylon absorbed his mother's words with the same quiet intensity he brought to chess matches. She wasn't angry at you, Braylon said finally, looking up at Xavier. She always said people can make mistakes without being bad people. The simple wisdom of a child speaking his mother's words brought fresh tears to Xavier's eyes. Your mother was the most forgiving person I've ever known. I'm learning that you are too. Dr. Patel's morning rounds interrupted their moment, bringing news that Braylon's latest blood work showed promising signs of engraftment. As she examined him, Braylon maintained his grip on both the letter and Xavier's hand. The chest X-ray looks good, Dr. Patel announced, and your white blood cell count is increasing steadily. If this continues, we might be able to discuss discharge planning in another week or so. Sister Margaret straightened in her chair. We'll need to prepare his room at Little Angel's. Actually, Xavier interrupted gently, I'd like to discuss alternatives. He looked at Braylon, who was watching the exchange intently. If you're willing, I'd like to petition the court for custody. My home is already prepared, a room, decorated just for you, with space for your violin practice and a special area for chess. He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Perhaps it was too soon, too much. But Braylon's face had lit up with interest. Would I still be able to visit Little Angel's? He asked, and play chess with Mr. Peterson in the park? Of course, Xavier assured him quickly. We'd maintain all the relationships and activities that are important to you. It would just mean having a real home with your father. Sister Margaret and Dr. Patel exchanged glances. There would need to be substantial preparation, Sister Margaret cautioned. Home studies, court approvals, transition planning. I understand, Xavier nodded, and I'm prepared to do everything necessary. But I thought, perhaps we could begin the process now, while Braylon recovers. Give us all time to adjust to the idea. Dr. Patel made some notes in Braylon's chart. From a medical perspective, having a stable home environment during recovery would be beneficial. The post-transplant period requires careful monitoring and consistent care. Braylon fingered the edge of his mother's letter. Mum said in here that you have a good heart, he said thoughtfully. She wanted us to be together if something happened to her. Xavier felt the weight of Abini's faith in him, carried across years and delivered at exactly the moment it was needed most. "She was wise about so many things," he said softly. "I'd like to honor her wishes and prove worthy of her trust in me." Sister Margaret rose, smoothing her habit. "I'll contact Patricia Montgomery about beginning the custody petition process. In the meantime, let's focus on your recovery, young man. I believe you have an unfinished chess game to complete with your father." As she left, Braylon turned to the chess set, his movements stronger than they'd been in days. "Mum also used to say that unfinished games need proper endings," he said, adjusting the pieces. "It was your move, Dad." Xavier studied the board, seeing now what he'd missed before, a subtle trap Braylon had set using his mother's favorite strategy. The realization made him smile through his tears. Even in illness, his son had been thinking 3 moves ahead, just as Abeni had taught him. The morning sun broke through the hospital blinds, illuminating the chess pieces and the letter that had bridged past and present. Somewhere, Xavier thought, Abeni was watching with that gentle smile he remembered, as father and son began to write their own next chapter, one move at a time. Chapter 9. Healing. The late autumn sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Xavier's penthouse, where contractors were putting the finishing touches on Braylon's new room. 2 weeks had passed since the bone marrow transplant, and while his son remained in the hospital, Xavier was determined to create a perfect space for his homecoming. The room had been transformed from an austere guest suite into a warm sanctuary. One wall featured built-in bookshelves, already filled with carefully chosen volumes, mystery novels Braylon loved, books about chess strategy, and classics Abeni had mentioned in her letter. A custom-designed music corner housed a violin stand and music sheets with acoustic panels to ensure perfect sound quality for practice. But the centerpiece was the chess area. Xavier had commissioned a craftsman to create a replica of the Central Park chess tables, the stone carefully matched to the ones where they'd first met. Beside it stood a glass display case, waiting to house Abeni's chess set in a place of honor. Dr. Chen, visiting to evaluate the space for Braylon's recovery, nodded approvingly. "You've thought this through carefully," she observed, noting the medical supplies discreetly organized in the ensuite bathroom. The familiarity of his favorite activities combined with the necessary medical accommodations, it's well balanced. Xavier adjusted a framed photo on the bedside table. One Harrison had recovered from Abeni's storage unit in Chicago, showing her teaching a 3-year-old Braylon his first chess moves. "I want him to feel at home here, but I also want to honor his life with Abeni. It's important that he knows she'll always be part of our family." The storage unit had been a treasure trove of memories, photo albums, school projects, recordings of early violin recitals. Xavier had spent hours going through everything, learning about the years he'd missed through Abeni's careful documentation of their son's life. Sarah, his former assistant, now promoted to Chief of Staff, entered with updates about the Abeni Amma Foundation. "The scholarship committee is formed," she reported. 5 full rides annually for single parents in law school, plus mentorship programs and childcare assistance. The first applications will open next semester. Xavier nodded, grateful for her help in honoring Abeni's legacy. "Have you coordinated with Little Angel's Home about the youth music program?" "Yes, Sister Margaret is helping design the curriculum. They're excited about expanding their arts education." Sarah hesitated. "The board is asking about your return timeline?" "They have my proxy for routine matters," Xavier replied firmly. "Mark is handling CEO responsibilities well. My focus right now is Braylon's recovery and transition." His phone buzzed. "Doctor, Patel with the latest test results." Braylon's numbers were improving steadily, and if the trend continued, he could be discharged within the week. Xavier felt the familiar mix of joy and anxiety at the news. Despite all the preparation, the responsibility of caring for a recovering child was daunting. At the hospital that afternoon, Xavier found Braylon sitting up in bed, working on schoolwork Sister Margaret had brought from his teachers. His color was significantly better, and his eyes were bright with their usual intelligence. "The contractors finished your room today," Xavier said, setting up the chess set for their daily game. "Dr. Chen approved everything for your recovery needs." Braylon looked up from his math worksheet. "Did you really put in a special chess area? Mrs. Thompson said you were planning something like the park tables." "Complete with the same kind of stone," Xavier confirmed. "Though I hope you'll still want to play with Mr. Peterson in the actual park once you're stronger." "Mom always said traditions are important," Braylon replied, moving to the chess table beside his bed. "She kept all our special places, even when we moved apartments. The library where she studied law, the music shop where I first saw a violin." Xavier recognized another opportunity to bridge their past and future. "Would you like to visit some of those places in Chicago someday? When you're fully recovered?" Harrison found your mother's journal with all her favorite spots marked. Braylon's eyes lit up. "Could we? There's this little Italian restaurant where she'd take me for birthday dinners. And the courthouse where she worked. She used to let me sit in her office after school." "We'll visit all of them," Xavier promised. "We can create a map of your mother's Chicago, make it a special trip to honor her memory." They played chess quietly for a while, Braylon demonstrating his returning strength with increasingly complex strategies. Finally, he spoke again. "Dad, at the penthouse, will there be space for Mom's piano?" Xavier's heart clenched. He hadn't known about the piano, but of course, Benny had accompanied Braylon's violin practice. "Absolutely. We can put it wherever you think best. Harrison can arrange for it to be moved from Chicago." "It's not fancy," Braylon warned. "Not like the ones in the magazines I saw of your home. It's kind of old, and one key sticks sometimes." "It's perfect," Xavier interrupted gently, "because it was hers. And it's part of your memories together. Those are the most important things we can have in our home." Dr. Patel arrived for evening rounds, pleased with Braylon's energy levels and appetite. As she examined him, she discussed the home care schedule, medications, follow-up appointments, physical therapy to rebuild strength. "You'll need to take it easy with the violin at first," she cautioned Braylon. "Short practice sessions, building up gradually, same with chess tournaments. We'll wait a few months before you return to competition." Braylon nodded seriously. "Mom always said patience is part of healing. She made me rest for 2 whole weeks when I had pneumonia, even though I felt better after 1. These casual mentions of Abini's wisdom, dropped naturally into conversation, had become precious to Xavier. Each one offered a glimpse of the mother she'd been, the daily love and guidance she'd provided. Later that evening, as Braylon dozed over a book about famous chess matches, Xavier worked on his laptop, finalizing details for the custody hearing. Patricia Montgomery had been instrumental in expediting the process, given the medical circumstances. Mrs. Thompson arrived for the evening shift, bringing fresh flowers for the room. Her initial skepticism about Xavier had softened since the transplant, though she remained appropriately vigilant about Braylon's well-being. "The Foundation's music program," she said quietly, arranging the flowers. "It's a beautiful way to honor both of them." Benny always believed in the power of arts education to heal and transform. Xavier closed his laptop. "I'm learning that she believed in many things I was too busy to understand back then. Second chances. The importance of presence over success. The real meaning of family." Mrs. Thompson smiled softly. "She's still teaching through him." She nodded toward Braylon. "Every story he shares, every value she instilled, she's making sure you learn what she always hoped you would." The truth of those words settled deep in Xavier's heart. Even now, Benny was guiding them both, Braylon with the strength and wisdom she'd poured into his early years, Xavier with the lessons he was finally ready to learn. As the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Xavier began his usual evening ritual of reading to Braylon. They were working through a collection of mystery novels Abeni had noted as their favorites in her journal. "Dad?" Braylon's voice was sleepy but clear. "When we go to Chicago, can we visit Mom? I haven't been able to bring her flowers since we moved." "Of course," Xavier replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll bring her favorite lilies, and you can tell her about your violin progress and chess victories. She'd want to know everything." "And about you," Braylon added, drifting towards sleep. "About how you're learning to play piano so you can accompany me like she did. She'd like that." Xavier touched the piano lesson schedule hidden in his briefcase, another surprise he was planning. "Yes, she would. Your mother always believed in the beauty of new beginnings." As Braylon slept, Xavier continued reading softly, the words creating a gentle backdrop to the hospital's quiet sounds. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky, and somewhere in that vast expanse he felt Abeni's presence. In their son's peaceful breathing, in the chess pieces standing guard, in the promise of healing that went far beyond physical recovery. Tomorrow would bring more progress, more preparations, more steps toward their new life together. But tonight, in this quiet room where father and son had found each other again, the simple act of reading a beloved story felt like the most important move of all. Chapter 10. Family History. 3 months after the bone marrow transplant, with Dr. Patel's approval and the court's permission, Xavier and Braylon boarded a private jet to Chicago. The winter sun was just rising over Manhattan as they took off, Braylon's face pressed against the window, watching his new home disappear beneath the clouds. In his lap, he clutched a leather-bound journal, Abeni's personal diary that Harrison had recovered from the storage unit. Xavier observed his son's reflection in the window, noting how much stronger he looked now. The transplant had been successful, and though recovery required ongoing care, Braylon had shown remarkable resilience. His violin practice had resumed, albeit in shorter sessions, and their daily chess games had never stopped. "Mom wrote about flying," Braylon said suddenly, opening the journal to a marked page. "She said the first time she came to Chicago for her job interview, she felt like she was flying toward a new chapter of her life." Xavier remembered that time, the excitement in Abeni's voice when she'd told him about the position with Justice Advocates International. He hadn't understood then why she'd choose public interest law over lucrative firm offers. Now, reading her journals, he finally grasped the depth of her commitment to helping others. The flight attendant served them breakfast, and Xavier reviewed their itinerary. They would spend 3 days following Abeni's footsteps through Chicago, visiting the places that had shaped her life with Braylon. Harrison had worked with Abeni's former colleagues to create a detailed map of their important locations. Their first stop after landing was Abeni's old law office. Justice Advocates International occupied a modest building in downtown Chicago, its mission statement etched in simple letters on the glass doors: "Equal justice for all." Inside, they were greeted by Maria Rodriguez, who had been Abeni's mentor and friend. "Welcome home, pequeño ajedrecista," she said warmly, using her old nickname for Braylon, little chess player in Spanish. She embraced him carefully, mindful of his still recovering strength, then turned to Xavier with measuring eyes. "And you must be Xavier. Abeni spoke of you often." Her office walls were covered with photographs of successful cases and client families reunited. Among them, Xavier spotted several pictures of Abeni, accepting awards, working with clients, and one that made his heart stop. Abeni and a toddler Braylon at a staff holiday party, both wearing Santa hats and bright smiles. "She was our star," Maria said, following his gaze. "Even with a young child and all the challenges of single motherhood, she never turned away a client in need. And Braylon was our office mascot, doing homework in the conference room, charming judges when he'd visit the courthouse. Braylon wandered around the office, touching familiar objects. A worn leather couch where he'd napped after school, a small chess set still sitting on a side table. "Mom used to let me play with the cleaning lady's son," he remembered. "She said chess doesn't care what language you speak." Maria led them to what had been Abeni's office, preserved much as she'd left it. "We couldn't bear to change it," she explained. Her work with immigrant families created precedents that still help people today. Xavier examined the diplomas and certificates on the wall, noting how many pro bono service awards Abeni had earned while simultaneously raising their son. On her desk, a photo of Braylon at his first chess tournament stood beside one from their law school graduation, the last picture ever taken of Xavier and Abeni together. "She kept that photo all those years?" Xavier asked softly. Maria's expression softened slightly. Abeni believed in remembering the good in people, even when paths diverge. She wanted Braylon to know his father through positive memories, not regrets or blame. They spent the morning looking through case files Abeni had worked on, Maria sharing stories of her dedication and innovation in family law. Braylon sat in his mother's chair, absorbing every detail, occasionally adding his own memories of falling asleep to the sound of her typing late at night. Their next stop was the apartment building where they'd lived, a modest but well-maintained complex near Lake Michigan. The current building manager, Mrs. Chen, had been there during Abeni's time and remembered them well. "Such a graceful lady," she recalled, leading them to the courtyard. "She would practice violin with Braylon right here in the evenings. The whole building would open their windows to listen." The courtyard featured a small chess table, not as grand as the ones in Central Park, but well loved. Braylon ran his fingers over the familiar squares. "Mum would play with me here while our laundry was running," he said. "She said it was important to find joy in ordinary moments." They visited Braylon's old elementary school next, where his former music teacher, Mr. Harrison, no relation to the investigator, still taught. He welcomed them warmly, pulling out videos of Braylon's early violin performances. "Your mother never missed a recital," Mr. Harrison told him. "Even when she had court in the morning, she'd be here, usually still in her suit, beaming with pride." They watched a recording of 5-year-old Braylon playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, while Abeni accompanied on piano. Xavier felt tears threatening as he watched their seamless interaction, the gentle way she supported their son's earliest musical efforts. Late afternoon found them at Gino's, the small Italian restaurant Braylon had mentioned, where they'd celebrated birthdays and special occasions. The owner, Giuseppe, embraced Braylon like a long-lost grandson. "Piccolo maestro," he exclaimed. "Your table is still here, just as your mama liked it." He led them to a corner booth with a view of the street. "She would help you with homework while waiting for your pizza, always the same order, margarita with extra basil." They ordered Abeni's favorite meal, and Giuseppe brought out a photo album of his own. "I keep pictures of my special customers," he explained, showing them snapshots of Braylon's birthday celebrations over the years. In each one, Abeni's pride and love shone clearly. "She always ordered tiramisu for dessert," Braylon remembered. "Even though she said it had too much coffee, she'd let me have a tiny bite." Giuseppe disappeared into the kitchen and returned with tiramisu decorated with a single candle. "For memories," he said simply. As evening approached, they faced the most challenging visit of their journey. The cemetery was peaceful under a light dusting of snow, Abeni's grave marked by a simple but elegant stone. Xavier had arranged for it to be surrounded by her favorite lilies, their sweet scent carrying on the winter air. Braylon knelt by the stone, arranging the fresh flowers they'd brought. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "Dad and I came to visit. I'm better now. His bone marrow fixed what was wrong with mine. Just like you wrote in your letter, he has a good heart." Xavier stood slightly back, giving his son space for this intimate moment. He watched as Braylon told his mother about their new life together, the special room Xavier had created, the foundation established in her name, the piano being carefully restored for their home. "And Dad's learning to play," Braylon continued, "so he can accompany my violin practice like you used to. He's not as good as you yet, but he practices every day. He says it's never too late to learn something new if it's important enough." Finally, Braylon stood and stepped back, taking Xavier's hand. "Your turn, Dad. You should talk to her too." Xavier knelt in the snow, touching the cold stone that marked the resting place of a woman whose grace and wisdom continued to guide them. "Hello, Abeni," he said quietly. "I'm sorry it took so long for me to become the man you believed I could be, but I promise you, I'm learning. Our son is teaching me just as you taught him." He told her about their daily chess games, about how he'd reorganized his entire life to put Braylon first, about the scholars her foundation would support. "You always saw the bigger picture," he continued. "While I was focused on corporate strategies, you were changing lives one family at a time. I understand now what really matters." As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, father and son stood together at Abeni's grave. Braylon placed a chess piece, a queen, on top of the stone. "It's from your travel set," he explained. "The one with the chip on the crown that made you laugh. I thought, maybe a part of our games should stay here with you." Xavier wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, feeling the strength that flowed between them. Strength born of shared blood, shared love, and shared loss. "Your mother once told me that the queen is the most powerful piece because she can move in any direction," he remembered. "Just like love can bridge any distance, heal any wound." They walked back to their waiting car as the cemetery lights began to come on, each lost in thoughts of the remarkable woman they'd loved in different ways. The day had been emotional but healing, filling in pieces of their shared history that had been missing. Back at their hotel, Braylon was quiet as they prepared for bed. He carefully placed Abeni's journal on his bedside table next to the photo of the three of them that Giuseppe had given them. A candid shot from his 4th birthday, Abeni and Braylon blowing out candles together while other diners smiled in the background. "Dad," he asked, as Xavier tucked him in, "do you think Mom knew this would happen? That we'd find each other and become a real family?" Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "I think your mother hoped for it. Everything she did. Keeping that graduation photo, writing the letter I'd find, teaching you chess the way she'd learned it with me. She was building bridges she hoped we'd someday cross." "She was good at that," Braylon nodded sleepily. "Building bridges, helping families find each other. Maybe that's why she became a lawyer instead of a chess champion." "I think you're right," Xavier agreed, smoothing his son's curls, so like Abeni's. "And tomorrow we'll visit more places she built those bridges. The courthouse where she worked, the community center where she taught English to immigrant families." But Braylon had drifted off to sleep, one hand resting on his mother's journal. Xavier sat watching him for a long time, seeing echoes of Abeni in his peaceful expression. Outside their window, Chicago's lights twinkled against the winter sky, each one perhaps marking a life his mother had touched, a family she had helped, a bridge she had built. Tomorrow would bring more memories, more stories, more pieces of the puzzle that was Abeni's life. But tonight, in this quiet room, Xavier felt closer to her than he had in years. She had given him the greatest gift twice, first in their son, and then in the chance to become the father she had always believed he could be. Chapter 11. The Verdict. The Manhattan family court building looked different in the spring sunshine than it had during their first hearing months ago. Cherry blossoms dotted the courthouse steps, and Braylon, now fully recovered from the transplant, climbed them with steady strength. He wore a new suit, a miniature version of Xavier's, but with a blue tie that had been Abeni's favorite color. 6 months had passed since the bone marrow transplant, 3 since their emotional journey to Chicago. In that time, they'd established a routine that blended their old lives with their new reality. Braylon still visited Little Angel's home regularly, playing chess with younger children and performing violin at their monthly concerts. Xavier had mastered enough piano basics to accompany simple pieces, though he still took lessons twice weekly, determined to honor Abeni's musical legacy. Patricia Montgomery met them in the courthouse lobby, her usual professional demeanor softened by genuine affection for Braylon. "The judge has reviewed all the home study reports," she said, leading them to a quiet corner. "Dr. Chen's evaluations are excellent, and Sister Margaret's recommendation is glowing." Xavier nodded, his hand resting protectively on Braylon's shoulder. The past months had been filled with evaluations, interviews, and careful documentation of their growing bond. Every chess game, every violin practice, every quiet evening reading together had been noted and assessed. Mrs. Thompson arrived next, representing Little Angel's home. Her initial skepticism had transformed into cautious support as she'd witnessed Xavier's unwavering commitment. "Braylon," she smiled warmly, "the younger children made you good luck cards. They're waiting at the home for after the hearing." The boy's face lit up. Despite his growing happiness with Xavier, he maintained close ties with the home that had sheltered him. Every Sunday, he and Xavier volunteered, there teaching chess to interested children and helping with homework. The Abeni Ama Foundation had expanded the home's music program, providing instruments and lessons to any child who showed interest. Judge Martinez's courtroom was more crowded than usual. Sister Margaret sat with several staff members from Little Angel's home. Maria Rodriguez had flown in from Chicago, representing Justice Advocates International and Abeni's former colleagues. Even Mr. Peterson, their chess partner from the park, had come to show support. As they waited for the judge, Xavier reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The chance encounter in the park seemed like a lifetime ago, yet he could still feel the shock of recognition when he'd first seen his son's face. Now, looking at Braylon's profile as the boy reviewed his chess strategies book, Xavier saw both Abeni's grace and his own determination reflected in their child's features. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Martinez entered. She smiled slightly at seeing Braylon, whom she'd come to know through multiple hearings and progress reports. "We're here today," she began, "to consider the petition for permanent custody of Braylon Ama by his biological father, Xavier Julian. This case has been unique in many ways, not least because of the extraordinary circumstances that brought father and son together." She shuffled through her papers, though Xavier suspected she knew every detail by heart. "The court has received extensive documentation, including medical records from the bone marrow transplant, psychiatric evaluations, home study reports, and character testimonies. We'll hear from several witnesses today before making our final determination." Dr. Chen testified first, describing Braylon's emotional growth over the past months. "The transition has been remarkably smooth," she explained. "Mr. Julian has shown exceptional sensitivity to Braylon's needs, maintaining important relationships while building new ones. Their bond has developed naturally, without forcing or rushing the process." Mrs. Thompson spoke next, her testimony carrying particular weight, given her initial concerns. "Braylon has flourished," she acknowledged. "Mr. Julian has proven himself not just as a father, but as a member of our extended community. Their Sunday volunteer work has become a highlight for our younger children." Maria Rodriguez's testimony provided crucial context about Abeni's hopes for her son. "I was with Abeni when she wrote that letter to Xavier," she revealed. She believed that if circumstances ever brought them together, he would rise to the challenge of fatherhood. Her faith in both of them has been vindicated. Throughout the proceedings, Braylon sat quietly beside Xavier, occasionally squeezing his father's hand when memories of Abini were discussed. They'd developed this silent support system during difficult moments, a gentle pressure that meant, "I'm here," without words. During a brief recess, they stepped into the hallway where Braylon could practice a few chess moves on his travel set, a calming ritual they'd established during stressful situations. Xavier watched his son's sure movements, remembering how Abini had used the same strategy to stay focused during law school exams. "Dad?" Braylon looked up from the board. "After this is over, can we still visit Little Angel's home? And play chess in the park with Mr. Peterson?" "Of course," Xavier assured him. "Those places and people are part of our family story now, just like we'll keep visiting Chicago and maintaining the connections there. Family isn't just about legal documents, it's about all the people who help us grow and learn." Braylon nodded, satisfied. Mum wrote that in her journal too. She said family is like a chess set. Every piece has its own way of moving, but they all work together to make something beautiful. Back in the courtroom, it was Xavier's turn to testify. He spoke about the changes he'd made in his life, the lessons he'd learned, and the joy of discovering fatherhood even at this late date. "Braylon and his mother have taught me what really matters," he concluded. "Success isn't measured in corporate acquisitions or profit margins, it's measured in moments of connection, in promises kept, in love given and returned." Judge Martinez asked Braylon if he wanted to speak. The boy stood, his posture reflecting both his mother's natural dignity and his father's quiet confidence. "I used to think having a family meant having everything perfect," he said clearly. "But Mom's journal talks about how real families are built day by day through hard times and good times. Dad and we're building ours that way. And Mom is still part of it, through music and chess and all the stories we share about her." His simple wisdom brought tears to several eyes in the courtroom. Judge Martinez smiled gently. "Thank you, Braylon. Would you like to play chess while I review my final notes?" Braylon looked questioningly at Xavier, who nodded. They set up the travel set on the attorney's table, their familiar routine creating a moment of calm in the formal setting. Several observers smiled at the sight of father and son engaged in their quiet game, while the judge completed her review. Finally, Judge Martinez cleared her throat. The bailiff called everyone to attention, and Xavier felt Braylon's hand slip into his. "Having reviewed all testimony and evidence," the judge began, "I find overwhelming support for granting permanent custody to Xavier Julian. The bond between father and son is genuine and nurturing, the home environment is stable and enriching, and all evaluations indicate this arrangement serves the child's best interests." She paused, looking directly at Braylon. "Young man, your mother was a respected colleague in these courts. Her work helped many families find their way to each other. I believe she would be proud to see how you and your father have done the same." The formal order was signed, copies distributed to all parties. But it was Sister Margaret who truly marked the moment's significance. She approached with a photo album the home had compiled, pictures of Braylon's time there, including the first chess game with Xavier. "Every child who leaves us for a permanent home gets one of these," she explained. "To remember that family can be found in unexpected places, and love doesn't diminish by being shared." Xavier accepted the album with deep gratitude, recognizing how it bridged their past and future. Braylon immediately opened it, pointing out memories to Maria and Mrs. Thompson, his excitement bringing smiles to everyone's faces. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Judge Martinez approached their table. "Mr. Julian," she said quietly, "I've been presiding over family court for 20 years. It's rare to see such a complete transformation in a parent. Your journey from corporate CEO to devoted father is quite remarkable." I had excellent teachers, Xavier replied, watching as Braylon showed Mr. Peterson a particularly challenging chess position he'd solved. My son, his mother through her journals and letters, the staff at Little Angel's home. They all helped me understand what Abeni knew years ago about the true meaning of success. They gathered their belongings, including the chess set that had become a symbol of their connection. The spring sunshine welcomed them as they left the courthouse, their extended family of supporters surrounding them with joy and congratulations. "Where to now?" Xavier asked his son, though he already knew the answer. "The park," Braylon replied confidently. "Mom always said important days should end with a game of chess where it all began." As they walked toward Central Park, their friends and supporters gradually dispersing with hugs and well wishes, Xavier felt Abeni's presence more strongly than ever. She had known somehow that this day would come. Her letter, her journals, her careful documentation of their son's life. She had built a bridge across years of separation, trusting that love would eventually find its way home. The chess tables waited in their familiar spots, dappled with spring sunshine filtering through new leaves. Xavier and Braylon set up their game, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the park where their story had begun. Looking at his son's face, alight with joy and secure in the knowledge of being loved, Xavier silently thanked Abeni for her faith, her wisdom, and the extraordinary gift of their child. The game began, each move carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future together. Around them, the park buzzed with life, witnesses to another chapter in their ongoing story of love, loss, redemption, and the endless possibilities of becoming a family. Chapter 12. Coming Home. The summer evening painted Manhattan in shades of gold as Xavier stood in the doorway of their penthouse's music room, watching Braylon practice his violin. Abeni's restored piano sat in pride of place by the window, its warm mahogany gleaming in the sunset light. A year had passed since their first meeting in Central Park, a year of profound transformation marked by love, healing, and the building of a family. Tonight was special, Braylon's first major violin recital since his recovery, but before they left for the concert hall, they had a ritual to complete. Xavier moved to the piano, his fingers finding the keys with growing confidence after months of dedicated practice. Together, they began the piece they'd chosen for this milestone, Bach's Air on the G string, Abeni's favorite. As they played, Xavier glanced at the photographs adorning the walls. Abeni teaching young Braylon chess, their first family photo from the hospital after his birth, Xavier and Braylon at the custody hearing, and countless moments from their new life together. A special frame held the Queen chess piece from Abeni's travel set, its companion piece still resting on her grave in Chicago, connecting their past and present. "Perfect timing," Xavier praised as they finished the piece. "Your mother would be proud of how you've mastered the dynamics." Braylon carefully placed his violin in its case, touching the small photo of Abeni he kept inside the lid. "Do you think she can hear us when we play?" he asked softly. "I believe she can," Xavier replied, thinking of all the ways Abeni's presence still guided them. "She's in every note you play, every chess move you make, every smile that reminds me so much of her." The concert hall buzzed with excitement as they arrived. The event was special not just for Braylon's performance, but because it marked the first anniversary of the Abeni Amma Foundation's music program. Children from Little Angel's home and other shelters across the city would perform alongside accomplished musicians, embodying Abeni's belief in the transformative power of arts education. Sister Margaret met them backstage, adjusting Braylon's bow tie with maternal care. "Your mother wore the same expression before her arguments in court," she remembered. "That perfect blend of nervousness and determination." The audience included their entire extended family, Mrs. Thompson and the Little Angel's home staff, Mr. Peterson from the park chess tables, Dr. Chen, who had guided their early bonding, Patricia Montgomery, who had championed their legal journey, and Maria Rodriguez, who had flown in from Chicago. Even Judge Martinez had come, sitting beside Giuseppe, the Chicago restaurant owner who had helped preserve so many of Braylon's childhood memories. But the front row held something special: 20 new Abeni Amma scholars, law students who were also single parents, each supported by the Foundation's comprehensive program. They represented Abeni's legacy of combining professional ambition with devoted parenthood, of building bridges between dreams and reality. As Braylon took the stage, Xavier felt the familiar tightness in his throat. His son stood tall, poised with his violin, wearing a blue tie clip that had been Abeni's gift on his first day of school. The piece he would play was one they had discovered in Abeni's papers. Sheet music marked with her annotations, waiting for the day her son would be ready for its challenges. The music began, filling the hall with emotions too deep for words. Xavier watched his son's sure movements, seeing echoes of Abeni in every graceful gesture. The piece spoke of love and loss, of finding your way home, of building something new from cherished memories. In the middle of the performance, a shaft of evening sunlight broke through the hall's high windows, surrounding Braylon in a warm glow. Several audience members later swore they could feel Abeni's presence in that moment, her love manifesting in the perfect harmony of her son's music. After thunderous applause and multiple bouquets, father and son slipped away from the reception to their special place, the chess tables in Central Park. The summer evening was peaceful, fireflies dancing around the stone tables where their story had begun. They set up Abeni's chess set, its pieces holding a year's worth of games, tears, laughter, and healing. As they played, Braylon spoke about his memories of Abeni, not with sadness now, but with a deep appreciation for the foundation she had built for his life. "Mum's journal had a quote about chess and life," he said, moving his bishop thoughtfully. "She wrote that the game doesn't end with checkmate. It ends with what you learned, what you felt, what you carried forward to the next game." Xavier smiled, recognizing Abeni's wisdom in their son's words. She was right, as usual. Every game teaches us something new, just like every day brings us new ways to be family. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them, carrying the distant sounds of the city and the closer melody of a street musician playing somewhere nearby. The chess pieces gleamed in the evening light, each one holding memories. The knight that had begun their first game together, the queen that connected them to Abeni's grave in Chicago, the king that Braylon had clutched during his hospital stay. "Dad?" Braylon looked up from the board, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what Mom wrote about how love is like a chess game. Sometimes you have to be patient, sometimes you have to be brave, and sometimes the best moves aren't the obvious ones." Xavier waited, hearing Abeni's gentle wisdom in their son's voice. "I think she knew that someday we'd find each other," Braylon continued. "That's why she kept teaching me chess the way you played, why she saved all those memories for us to find. She was setting up the board for a game that would bring us together." Tears pressed at Xavier's eyes as he reached across the table to squeeze his son's hand. "Your mother was the most remarkable person I've ever known," he said softly. "And she created something even more remarkable, you, with your music and your wisdom and your capacity for love." They finished their game as the park lights began to come on, fireflies still dancing around them like stars brought down to earth. The summer air was sweet with memories and possibilities, with the knowledge that family isn't just about blood or legal documents. It's about the choices we make every day to love, to remember, to grow together. As they walked home, Braylon carrying his violin case and Xavier holding the cherished chess set, they passed the spot where they had first met a year ago. A new family was at the chess tables. A father teaching his young daughter the basic moves, her face bright with concentration. "Should we tell them," Braylon asked with a smile, "about how chess can change your life?" Xavier looked at his son, this extraordinary boy who had Abeni's heart and his mind, who had taught him more about love and courage than any business success ever could. "I think they'll discover their own story," he replied. "Just like we did." At home, Braylon placed his violin carefully beside Abeni's piano, the two instruments symbolic of their joined lives. The chess set took its place in the custom display case, lit softly from above, each piece holding memories of the journey that had brought them together. Later that night, as Xavier tucked his son into bed, Braylon asked for one more story about Abeni. It was their nightly ritual now, sharing memories, keeping her presence alive in their hearts. As he spoke about her laugh, her determination, her endless capacity for love, Xavier felt the completion of a circle that had begun long ago in a Columbia University library, where a brilliant law student had taught a focused business major that some games are worth more than winning. The city lights twinkled beyond their windows, each one perhaps marking another family finding its way home, another story of love transcending time and loss. In Braylon's room, Abeni's photos watched over their son's sleep, her smile as bright and hopeful as ever. Tomorrow would bring new games, new music, new chances to honor her memory through their love for each other. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of their home, Xavier thanked whatever fate or divine plan had brought him back to that chess table in Central Park, giving him the chance to become the father Abeni had always believed he could be. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning, with every move guided by love, every strategy shaped by memory, every moment enriched by the extraordinary gift of family. Subscribe if you liked.